Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you to the Alliance Française, as Alan said. We also want to give a warm welcome to Jari Honora, the esteemed genealogist at the Historical Genealogists Collection, who is the invited guest because of your discoveries for Pope Leo's Black Creole roots here in New Orleans. So if you want to just start by talking a little about yourself, a little about what you do as a genealogist, and just the overall buzz around what's been going on with Pope Leo and your discoveries.
Sure. Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. Or should I say bonjour tout le monde? Je m'appelle Jari Honora. Je lis et j'écris français bien, mais je ne parle pas français couramment. So I'll speak in English this evening. Otherwise, I'll make more grammatical mistakes than I do in English. But it's a pleasure to see you all this evening. And I work as the family historian at the Historic New Orleans Collection, particularly in our Williams Research Center, which is at 410 Charter Street. It is open to the public. It is not a municipal archive or tied to a university per se. It's an independent archive established in 1966, and we have collections that have been given to us or that we have otherwise acquired over the last, 5-6 decades. And our catalog is fully searchable online, catalog.hnoc.org, and we welcome you to come and utilize our materials. I have just a few slides that we'll run through. I won't take too much of your time with these because I think that Ramon and I talking will be more instructive than anything. So we start here, right? We start with May 8th of this year when we, like the rest of the world, learned that there was a new pope for the Roman Catholic Church, Leo XIV, who by birth is Robert Francis Prevost, or Prévost, born in 1955 in Chicago. And if you're like most New Orleanians, they immediately ran up and down the streets, up and down the highway saying, "Oh, Prevost, I know Prevost or Prévost. My mother's a Prevost, my daddy's a Prevost, I went to school with Prevost, I danced with a Prevost at the autocrat." I mean, it was just crazy, right? And many of them have assumed that that is what inspired me to take a look at the Holy Father's lineage, is that the name Prevost or Prévost was a Louisiana name. And I can understand why people make that assumption, but when we do genealogical research and we do historical research, one of the things we don't want to do is to work off of assumptions. We can maybe work off of some educated guesses and then test those hypotheses to see if they flesh out, if they pan out. But Prevost or Prévost, the name is actually most numerous. So you have the largest group of carriers of that name actually in Texas, then California, then Louisiana. And for those of us who are part of this whole, Louisiana Creole diaspora, that's not surprising for us because we know that many of our Louisiana surnames appear with great frequency in East Texas, where a lot of our cousins moved, or in California, where a lot of our cousins moved. So those are the three states where the name has the most carriers. But the name occurs most frequently, one in about 8,000 in Louisiana, and then secondly in Vermont, which is also understandable because Vermont has a large French-Canadian population. People for generations have crossed into Vermont, New Hampshire, that whole section of the country. So I get why people thought that, Prévost, it's got to be Louisiana. But we don't work from assumptions, right? And so we start digging into the documents, right? This is what we build our research upon, is documentary evidence. And this is actually the birth certificate for Pope Leo's dad, his father, Louis Marius Prévost, born in 1920 in Chicago. And it gives us some information. It tells us that the Pope's grandfather, his father's father, was Jean Prévost, a French teacher, an instructor, or in this case, actually he's a salesman, born in France, and that his mother is Suzanne Fabre, born in France, right? And you could even compare that to his only sibling, his brother Jean, who was born 3 years earlier in 1917, and the father again is Jean Prévost, a teacher or instructor, and the mother is Suzanne Fabre, or in this case Fibre, which is I guess the closest you can get to Fabre in Lackawanna, New York, right? And it says again that they're both from France. But we don't stop with just those two documents that are based upon the assertions, the testimony of the parents of the children themselves. We continue our research and no. We continue our research and we see that John Prévost, who is a lifelong teacher of French and other foreign languages, he appears in the census under that name. He is buried under that name. This is his newspaper obituary transcript of his death certificate in the Chicago area under that name. But there's a little twist. We see that in the 1950 census, he is listed as a native of not France, but Italy. And then also on his death certificate, the birthplace is listed as Italy. And the question becomes, why? Why this conflict in the records? How does this Jean Prévost get to be a native of Italy? Well, we get confirmation that we're talking about the same person, explicit confirmation in one record, and that is this register of aliens who are in the country, meaning non-citizens who are in the country from the 1940s, World War II era, and it tells us that John Rigatano Prévost actually entered this country as Salvatore Giovanni Rigatano. And so the person who lives an entire lifetime as John R. Prévost, or Prévost, the foreign language teacher, actually was Salvatore Giovanni, the Italian for John, Rigatano. And if you go one more slide, why? Why is this? Why this name change? Well, in 1917, the good professor who's seen here, so this is Pope Leo's paternal grandfather, who advertised extensively as a teacher of foreign languages, he was caught up in a love triangle. Not unlike, the drama families find themselves in today, where Professor Rigatano, who was married to a woman of similar age, he actually had, what would we say, an entanglement with a younger woman, 20 years his junior, by the name of Suzanne, not Fabre, but Suzanne Fontaine. Suzanne Fontaine, who was also a foreign language instructor. This came to the knowledge of his wife, and she reported the story to the papers. And so in May of 1917, this story broke that Professor Rigatano and his young colleague by the name of Suzanne Fontaine, they had been caught up in a romance, and it made the papers. They disappear from Illinois for a few months. They resurface in Lackawanna, New York, just outside of Buffalo, but not as Rigatano, but as Jean and Suzanne Prévost. So just that simply, just in a matter of months, in the year 1917, they transition, they shift their identity from Rigatano or Fontaine in the case of the grandmother to Prévost. Why Prévost? Well, we get the origin, sort of the why for that name, from the civil act of birth, the état civil in Le Havre for Suzanne Louise Marie Fontaine, and it tells us that her mother was Jeanne Eugénie Prévost. So when she created this new identity for herself, she utilized the maiden name of her mother as the family name. And this is more common than you think. This is why, even if you're dealing with a name that you think is as simple as Smith or Jones, you have to pursue the documentary evidence to confirm whether you're really dealing with Smith or Jones or, any host of other of other names. And that speaks to the two basic questions that we deal with in genealogy. People think that it's the begats, almost like the biblical genealogies, Peter begat this one and this one begat that one. No, we're dealing with, at every step, questions of identity and questions of relationship. Who's who and who is kin to who and how. These are the basic building blocks if we're going to do this research correctly. Next slide. And so now we get to the part that I think most of you are really interested in, being residents of New Orleans, and that is the Pope's maternal family. And I'll tell you that prior to doing this research, the very first source that I checked was Wikipedia, like so many of us, and it simply gave a one-line answer that the Pope's mother, Mildred Martinez, perhaps you would say, was of Spanish extraction. Well, now we know that that's far from the truth, right? Her parents, Joseph Naval, her parents, Joseph Naval Martinez and Louise Baquier, were both from New Orleans. They were married here in 1887 in Our Lady of the Sacred Heart Church, Notre Dame de Sacré-Cœur, which at that time was at Annette and North Claiborne. It came down in the hurricane of 1915, but that was their neighborhood, that area of the Seventh Ward of the city. Joseph Naval was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, in 1864, and Louise was born here in New Orleans in 1868. So both from New Orleans families, both of whom raised their 6 of their 7 daughters were born here in New Orleans. The 7th and last daughter, Mildred Agnes Martinez, the Pope's mother, was born after they had migrated to Chicago at some point between 1910 and 1911. And here you see 4 of their daughters. You see the Pope's mother, who is pictured here, Mildred Martinez, and 3 of her sisters. She had 2 other sisters who are not pictured here. Those sisters, one became a religious sister of mercy. The same sisters who were at St. Alphonsus and St. Mary's Assumption, just a few blocks from here in the Irish Channel, and another became a religious a sister servant of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a BVM sister. So they're not pictured here. One of the things you'll observe is that post-migration, after going northward to Chicago in 1940, in 1930, in 1920, all of these individuals, the entire households, their racial identifier is white. The next slide. In 1910 even, when they were living, so this is their last address in New Orleans before migrating up to Chicago, how much more New Orleans can you get than living in the Upper Pentalba apartment building? So the Upper Pentalba building is the one on the uptown, the Canal Street side of Jackson Square, seen here. And you may think it's an exclusive address today, but then remember, the corner was very much a working class neighborhood. It's people, making a living, just like any other families. And you see they were listed as white, but you start to see the sort of confusion, obfuscation as to their origins. The dad, Joseph N. Martinez, lists himself as a native of Santo Domingo. And I think you know from your studies that despite the fact that the colony that is now the Republic of Haiti was Saint-Domingue, in English, for whatever reason, it is almost always rendered as Santo Domingo. I guess Americans don't know how to differentiate the two sides of the island. But Santo Domingo. But then it may be difficult to see here his father's nationality and birthplace and his nationality are actually listed as Maltese. And since all of this has come forward, I've even had a journalist call me from Malta, and I had to disappoint him. I said, no, there's no Maltese connection. But you can understand how easy it was to sort of assume a different identity when you live in a neighborhood, in a block, a single block, that has individuals who are Sicilian, who are German, who are from Australia, who are British, another family of Sicilians, and yes, even a family, the Grec or Gretsch family who actually are Maltese. So you just sort of have your pick as to which one of these identities, if you're seeking to sort of obfuscate your origins, you really want to go with. But in the 1900 census, seen here at 1933 North Prayer Street, right in the 7th Ward, about 3 doors from North Claiborne, the house is no longer standing. That whole section was taken for on-ramps or off-ramps for the Claiborne overpass. This is where they were living in 1900. Joseph Martinez, a cigar maker, his wife, and his growing family. The next time. And even as far back as 1970, they are in the 7th Ward of the city, listed as either black or in this case, mulatto. In this case, Nerval, or Joseph Nerval, his father was a tailor, lifelong tailor, and Louise Bacquier, his wife, her father was a shoemaker, was a lifelong shoemaker in the 7th Ward neighborhood. Even prior to this time, in 1861, right on the, almost at the very beginning of the Civil War, they, like so many other free people of color, les gens de couleur libre, they were required to appear in the mayor's office at Gallia Hall, then City Hall, and pay 50 cents each and bring either a copy of a legal act of manumission, typically passed before a notary, or an act of baptism, meaning that they were baptized as free or freed upon baptism, or the testimony of reputable white citizens that they were indeed free and entitled to remain in this state. Because at varying points in time, the state had legislation, statutes, that if you manumitted, that is, set an enslaved person free, or they purchased their freedom or what have you, they had to leave the state. And so those who were legally entitled to remain here had to attest to all of that, and it had to be registered in these books in the mayor's office, or outside of Orleans Parish, in the office of the parish judge. Information that was descriptive in nature, such as name, such as their sex and color. Color, because of course this is an era long before photo identification was commonplace, long before the creation of the Social Security system. And so how else would you identify a person other than physical descriptors? And so when people say, why did they go through such lengths to say, en mulâtre rouge, or, en mulâtre jaune, yellow mulatto, and all these sort of detailed descriptions, is because that's the only identifying information they had, along with things like height, such as 5 feet 6 inches, birthplace, occupation, and what have you. They had to, again, register in 1861 before a mayor at the time, Mayor James Monroe, who the very year that he came to New Orleans in the 1820s, both of these individuals, Jacques Antonio Martinez and Marie Rosa Ramos Martinez, the great-grandparents of Poplio, their families had been in New Orleans for at least a century before that. We're talking the 1720s. And so individuals who were as rooted as you can possibly be in this place, all of a sudden, one of the indignities they had to endure is having to go and testify before a man who spoke no French, who was totally en American. And old people, they would almost spit on the ground at the same time. They had to go and testify before him that they had a right to remain in their birthplaces. The next slide. As a result of this, at some point between 1861 and 1864, the Martinez family, the husband, Jacques, a tailor, his wife, their children, one of Jacques' uncles, and his sister, they all make the decision to try to make a life for themselves elsewhere. In this period, the late 1850s, 1860s, many free people of color, after enduring, you can imagine, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Dred Scott decision, these prescriptive laws about registration, carrying on their person some sort of proof of their free status, they make a decision to go to Mexico, places like Tampico or Veracruz. They go to Cuba. They go to Haiti. Many of them go to France. They go anywhere but remaining in New Orleans or in South Louisiana. And so they go to Port-au-Prince. They stay for anywhere between 2 and 4 years, and this is actually their return to New Orleans in February of 1866. And so their last child, Joseph Navarre Martinez, the Pope's grandfather, that's why he was born in Port-au-Prince. He was born during this period of, again, between 2 and 4 years, when they sought to create a life for themselves in Haiti, in Haiti. And so, just to give you an idea of this expansive Louisiana family that I've told you about, I hope that it's legible for you. You see here the parents of Pope Leo, and you see the tree expands to his maternal grandparents, and then their forebears before that, their ancestors, who carry names such as Panquinet or Panquinet, which is actually Romani in origin. Not only is Pierre Denis Panquinet Roma, and he was the sacristan or caretaker for the cathedral. So again, how much in the 1770s? So again, how much more New Orleans can you get than that? That the Pope's great grandfather was the sacristan of St. Louis Cathedral in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. His wife, Marie-Louise Castel, was also of a Roma background. And when I say Roma, these individuals who identified in French as les Bohèmes, the gypsies, the Romani people, they arrived here in 1721. New Orleans, if you don't remember your school book history, New Orleans is established 1780. So this is almost as early as you can get. You have the Ramos family, who settled here from Cuba. You have the Guénon family, which goes back to Normandy and France. You have Arnaud Rayo, who comes from Bordeaux. His partner, Julien, who is a manumitted slave, born a slave, but acquires her freedom in the 1780s. You have Jean-Pierre Baquier, whose family were formerly planters in Guadeloupe. He is blonde, he is white, Jean-Aristide Baquier, who's white. However, he has children with 2 women of color, one of whom is Celeste Lemel, and Lemel is from St. Landry Parish, and is a huge family. So Lemel is like Smith or St. Landry, in Imperial St. Landry Parish, as they like to remind you. And her ancestors likewise go back, well into the colonial period, including her mother Celeste Grandpré, whose father Charles-Louis Boucher de Grandpré was commandant at Baton Rouge and Pointe Coupée during the American Revolution. So Charles Grandpré is actually one of at least 3 ancestors of Pope Leo from Louisiana who are patriots of the American Revolution. You have Jeannette Gladion, who was born enslaved and who receives her freedom at Pointe Coupée in 1780. You have Eugène Grombois. Grombois was born in France. He was a pharmacist. And his partner, Odile Coppel, who was born here in New Orleans in the 1820s. And so just from this menagerie of ancestors, this is where the maternal family of Pope Leo descends. So I just want to sort of end off the slides by highlighting one particular ancestor of Pope Leo's. As I mentioned, most of the residences, the physical structures attached to their history are gone, have evolved. It may be the same site, but a newer structure. But of course, one of the things that we can all claim, one of the places that our French heritage is most visible is in our cemeteries. I can't tell you how many grave markers ici repose, ici reste. And in this case, we have in the wall vault of St. Louis Cemetery number 2, square 3, which is along Claiborne Avenue between Iberville and Bienville Streets. This wall vault, which is for Dame Marie Bourret, née à Saint-Marc, born at Saint-Marc in Haiti in the 1770s and who dies here in New Orleans in 1848. By the way, in that vault contains not only Marie Bourret, but it contains her daughter, Marguerite Cadenet, her grandson, Jacques Martinez, his wife, Rosa Martinez, and their eldest son, in fact, the only son who remained in New Orleans, Michel Martinez. The other three children all migrated to Chicago, and as we see, they passed away. But Marie herself, the matriarch here, she is born in Saint-Domingue at a place called Montreuil. Montreuil is just outside of Saint-Marc. She gets to Louisiana after having, of course, first gone to Cuba, like so many emigres, as a part of the Haitian Revolution. And she is manumitted here by the widow and Anne-Sophie Jeanton Bourret in 1818. And this is from her actual act of manumission passed before the notary Lind in 1818. But before this act could be carried out, the widow Bourret had to appear before the parish judge here in Orleans Parish and state, that she wanted to manumit this person and get the permission of the parish judge. And she states that Marie, who at that time was 45 years old, was the whole possession. It's sort of strange to talk about a person as being somebody's whole possession, but meaning that she entirely belonged to the widow Bourret. She wasn't co-inherited or a partial ownership or anything like that. Yes, enslaved people could be inherited, could be mortgaged, could be sold, could be transferred, just like any other piece of property, could be rented out, just like any other piece of property. But she was her whole possession, born on the island of Hispaniola, where the slave was born. And one of the last steps in this process is that for 40 days, and I don't know if any of you are people of faith, but you think about the many biblical implications of 40 days, this notice would have been posted conspicuously within this parish, within Orleans Parish, perhaps on the door of the principal church, saloons, town hall, places where people gather. Remember, this is before email blasts and all of this. You had to post this legal notice questioning whether anybody had legal opposition to the manumission of Marie, who had already moved from a native Saint-Domingue to Cuba to New Orleans as an enslaved person, and subsequently does obtain her freedom in both the English and French languages, because both of these were legal languages in Louisiana at that time and for a long time thereafter. Fortunately for her, no one did make opposition, and she was freed. But just the fact that a woman of this background, an enslaved woman later freed, is the third great grandmother of the man who now sits on the chair of St. Peter, I think is an incredible story. It's a New Orleans story. Even the 20th century history of passing and of sort of forgetting, maybe conveniently forgetting this history, is very much a Louisiana story. And so I'll stop there, and I know Ramon and I know we have some engaging questions that we'll go through.
Well, just my first question from all of this is, when you said people assume, I was one of the people who wrongfully assumed that when you saw the last name Prevost, when Pope Leo stood on the Loggia of Blessing, that Prevost was the spark that led you into this discovery. So I apologize for that, but I'm glad that you were able to clear that up. My second question would be, how long did it take for you to compile all of this together and present it, the way you've been presenting it since you made the discovery?
The initial discovery that Pope Leo's mother's family was definitely rooted here in New Orleans, that was the same day. That was, May of this year. It was the same day, and that's when I sort of just shared my findings, several documents online, and I honestly thought that it would be of interest to sort of my many friends who are in the business, as we say, genealogists, historians, people who are involved in this whole Louisiana French, Louisiana Creole Renaissance. But I was wrong. It kind of captured the interest of people around the world. And I'm grateful for that. But the more extensive stories, like the story of Marie, the story of Jeanette, who was also an enslaved matriarch of his, that research took, I would say, 3-4 weeks. And it's still ongoing. There's still several lines. You notice that there was one line that ended with Odile Coppell, and I'm still working on that line. So it's never ending. Anybody who's done this knows that you never finish. You get to sort of a comfortable stopping point, but you never finish.
So that will be my next thing about that. So you started with one, and then it's like you find another thing and another thing, and it turns into this big patchwork of information, of primary sources. If somebody were to want to discover their own family history or their own lineage, how do they begin that? And then how do they continue it?
Sure. Fortunately for us, we live in a time where we can begin a lot of our research online, be it in what is now the United States, or in France, or throughout the Francophone world, where we have the Archives des États Civils online, or we have in the U.S. we have Ancestry.com. We have FamilySearch.org, which have census records, and they have transcripts of vital records online. But one of the twists that we find is that many of us in New Orleans or in South Louisiana, sadly, are no longer have French as a maternal language. We may come to learn it, but it's not a household language that we grew up with. And so you find that there are many instances where names were anglicized, or where there may be a unique pronunciation that we're not aware of that impacts our research. I have to tell you a funny story. I have some cousins, and they have a great-grandmother that I heard a lot about because I sought out the elders and wanted to interview them and talk to them and everything. And they said, well, Jari, our great-grandmother, what was her name? I said, oh, her name was Elodie. And they said, yeah, we know that, but what was her name? I said, her name was Elodie. And they said, yes, we know that, but what did the LOD stand for? And I said, it didn't stand for anything. They thought they thought that she was always referenced by initials L-O-D. I said, no, that's not it at all. I said, that's a beautiful French name. Elodie, that was her name. But you can see over the passage of generations, moving away from French or Creole, they didn't understand that was a name. Because I don't think you'd find many young ladies or girls today named Elodie. And so that's just a little anecdote about how language and culture impacts the research.
And I'm, as somebody who's done my own genealogical research, there's times when I've come to dead ends where I just can't find any more information because of either language barriers or documents being lost or family that was enslaved. What do you tell people who may come across the same thing where they've come to a roadblock in their finding for them to keep on going, or like to find encouragement to dig deeper, maybe pivot somewhere else?
Definitely. So there's a term we use, it's called fan club research. This term was coined by Elizabeth Joan Mills, who's well known in Louisiana, published many books, especially on the Cane River community. And it means friends, or some people say friends, family, associates, and neighbors. Everybody has a fan club, right? And it means that, like most of our families, you're not dealing with just a single child. You're dealing with somebody who had 5, 10, 15. In one case, I know of 30 siblings. And so you pursue those lines, and you look for clues amongst those people. You start prying into the lives of individuals who served as witnesses to acts for your ancestors. You look at people who were their co-workers, neighbors. You look at, there's a term we use, compairage. You know, you look at the network of who was the maran, who was the parent to who, and you see family networks that you build up that way. And that, it takes time. That's not the sort of easy, superficial level research, but it really helps. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up about looking at close relatives and family members and friends, because baptismal records, wedding records, funeral records, all of those things you have witnesses for, people who have been witnesses to. And what I've learned from just visiting HNOC or talking to other historians is that, so we're talking about Pope Leo being the head of the Catholic Church. Churches are centers where these records have been preserved, and sometimes preserved in really good condition. So what can people do in order to, I guess, engage with their church or churches around here, or diocese maybe, and start digging into this research to find who they are, where they come from? That's
a great question. Well, in terms of researching using Catholic sacramental records, a little plug, on July 11th, we're going to have a whole program about that at the Historic New Orleans Collection. But the short answer is in Louisiana and really throughout the South of the American South, keeping civil, governmental vital records is relatively new. In Louisiana, outside of a city like New Orleans or say Shreveport or Baton Rouge, those three cities really exclusively, there was no mandate to keep civil birth or death records for anybody, rich, poor, black, white, in between, until 1914. Think about that. If you have a mama or papa who was born in Lafayette, or born in Lake Charles, or born in St. Martinville prior to 1914, it's not a question of if. They don't have a civil birth certificate like you or I do. They don't have there is no death record civilly. Just a comparison, Mississippi, 1912. Texas, 1903. Whereas our friends who come from the New England states and back on the East Coast, they have civil records, vital records going back in some cases to the 1600s. So fortunately for us, in a place like Louisiana, where the population is heavily Catholic, records of baptisms, church marriages, and funerals fill that gap, or can fill that gap. They have been published in books for the Archdiocese of New Orleans up through 1831, which is still a bit of a challenge because that's close to 200 years ago. So you have to work your way back to that point, which is even more difficult if you come from enslaved ancestors or free people of color who may or may not have used surnames. For the Diocese of Baton Rouge, which covers places like St. James, St. Ascension, and so on, those books have been published through 1905. And for the Diocese of Lafayette, there was a wonderful priest scholar by the name of Father Donald Hebert, and Father Hebert published those books through the early 20th century. So you can utilize those.
And I just want to touch on another thing about records of enslaved people. What's the best resource, or is there a local resource that people can use to discover some of those records, or an online database, or how would we go about discovering? Because personally, my great-grandmother was born in Lafourche Parish, and I've heard stories about her grandmother was enslaved, and I don't know where to find documents prior to that. So where could somebody like me start with that?
So the key thing with researching formerly enslaved people is you have to scour every possible record on their lives post-emancipation. And when I say scour, you're looking for every possible clue. You're looking even into the names of their children to see if those names tie back to maybe prospective slave owners or other families with whom they might have been enslaved. You're looking at whether, maybe not the female ancestor, but her husband, her dad, her brother might have fought in the Civil War and thus has a Civil War pension record. And if you think it's hard to get your Social Security or get your employment pension now, just imagine back then when you had no documentation to bring to the office. You had to bring yourself to the office, and you had to spill the beans. You had to tell your whole life story to verify that, yes, I'm the person entitled to this pension. and I work with them often, and so they had to tell their life stories, and so that's a big source. After you scour those lives, you're looking for any clues that point you to potential slaveholders. And that's the mental shift that you have to make when you're doing enslaved research, is that you're not researching one family, you're sort of researching two, both the enslavers and their many twists and turns. They have good times, they fall on hard times. They buy enslaved people, they sell enslaved people. Somebody dies, they bequeath the enslaved people to the next generation. A daughter marries, the enslaved people are part of her dowry. These are all of the factors that you have to take into consideration. So you're researching two families: the enslaved people, who are your ancestors, and the enslavers who own them and may also potentially be your family, as is the case with many of our families.
Yes.
As is the case with many of our families. So.
Yeah, welcome to New Orleans.
And New Orleans being one of the few cities with a majority black population, majority Catholic population, how do you see, I know you talked earlier about, you've been talking about Pope Leo since May. Do you see this adding a deeper sense of pride for the black Catholic community here, knowing that Pope Leo has roots in New Orleans and may one day even plan a papal visit if he visits North America, and hopefully he has a stop. He might go to Chicago, but we're hoping that he comes to New Orleans, maybe puts on a Saints jersey or something like that. How do you see that adding to the pride that black Catholics have in the city?
I think it already has. His election has already added to the pride that black Catholics have, that someone who shares our background, maybe not our lived experience, but who certainly shares our roots, our bloodline, is this big gift that we've offered to the church, is a real point of pride. And of course, it's a point of pride, but it also just puts us in the mindset of our history, knowing that, it wasn't until the 1950s that we had a identified black diocesan priest here in New Orleans. It's not until the 1960s that really the Catholic parochial schools and high schools integrated in this city. And many people remember that if they didn't go to the segregated colored parish, be it here, be it in the rural parishes, they had to sit in the back of the white parish. They had to go to approach the table for Holy Communion, which is our belief, after all the white parishioners had gone. That's in the lifetimes of my grandparents, for sure, great-grandparents. And so, not to be too biblical about it, but the scripture that's been running through my mind constantly is that one, that the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And I think that even though there was some twists and turns, that it was a little bit of, going on the other side, as we say, passing, it's surfaced. And I think that this is, it's a godsend. And the fact that one of our candidates for sainthood, Henriette de Lille, who's from New Orleans, born of a woman of color, with an enslaved African great-grandmother, with this sort of mixed heritage, is a candidate for sainthood at this time, just adds to it even further.
This is my last question or topic before opening it up for audience commentary, but I've noticed that on all of the readings that I've found about Pope Leo's genealogy, it lists Black Creole, just straight up Creole. So can you talk a little about the definition of what Creole is? Because some people may be confused, and even in New Orleans, a lot of people have it ill-defined, where it's like, it means light skin, curlier hair, French, Spanish last name. So can you clear up exactly what it means to have a Creole identity in New Orleans, in Louisiana?
A whole other discussion.
Just the clip notes version.
Say do. That's hard. A lot of people have the notion that that Creole equals mixed race, and that is not true. A lot of people have the notion that Creole equals some subset of or group of people of color, of African descent, and that's not true. Creole is both a culture, and Louisiana Creole is a culture and a language. that is shared, that is spoken by people here in Louisiana and in all of our expat communities across the color line. People who are white, people who are black, people who consider themselves maybe somewhere in between, people of indigenous background. And the word Creole, and the thing that I think ties us in with Creole communities all around the globe is that they're rooted in the Latinized, French, Spanish, Portuguese, whatever, colonial experience, and in the mixtures that I think more readily took place in those colonial experiences, more than, say, in the Anglo world. And the fact that there are people rooted in these New World places and in these New World experiences. Creole comes from the Latin word creare, which means created. Something that's new, something that's not exclusively African, not exclusively from Europe, not exclusively of indigenous background, but something that's created amongst all those groups of people and rooted here. And I think that's the defining hallmark of all Creole families, be they white, black, whatever, is that they're rooted in colonial Louisiana. They either speak or did speak one of our heritage languages like Creole or French or Spanish, and Roman Catholicism and Roman Catholic practices. That's the other big hallmark. And like I always tell people, in Creole, to me, it really sort of comes to the forefront and becomes something to speak of is when we're inundated after the sale of Louisiana with all of these American people. We're still being inundated with American people, whether that's a good or bad thing. These people who come to Louisiana afterwards, who come with a background that is different. And if you grew up like I did, my grandparents, my grandfather, grandmother, my great-grandparents, they would still describe, you don't want to eat from Therese. She don't fix food, but she fix food the American way. Or they would say, all the good Creole boys, and why does Susie got to go marry an American boy? We lived, that was spoken. Or if they didn't say American, they'd say American. They sort of cut it off to American. That consciousness that we are somehow different, I think is also part of that Creole experience. And that's shared by people who are as perhaps aristocratic as a Charles Guy or Alcea Forte, and people who are as modest as in my family who were cane cutters or cane processors, so. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll open up to audience questions now if anybody wants to take the first one.
As you've been talking, since you've been talking about the poet for all these months,
Yes.
How does he identify himself?
Definitely not as a Louisiana Creole. I think he identifies, I think the Pope himself identifies as a citizen of the world, as a child of God. One of the things I've said in some interviews is that I don't think this could have happened to a better person, this sort of revelation, especially sort of in midlife or late in life, because he is so open to other cultures. To be a Chicagoan, a baby boomer, born in 55 on the south side of Chicago, entirely white schools, white high school, white seminary, majority white religious order, but to spend 40 years on mission in South America, learning other cultures, speaking other languages, he speaks 5 languages at least, I think that he's very open and sees himself as sort of a universalist.
So he doesn't identify as Creole, is what you're saying?
No, it's not as Creole, not as black.
His brother.
Yeah, his brother said.
That's what I said. His brother said, they was talk about that, but we didn't know nothing.
Yeah, his brother said, we were aware of our Haitian and Creole heritage, but he said we never identified.
Yeah.
He said he identified as white.
Yeah, as white.
That's what I saw that same interview.
Right. And I think, and of course, that's the two brothers speaking. We don't know what, Pope Leo's viewpoint is.
Well, he said we never talked
They
about
never
that
talked
sort
about
of
it. They had
thing.
no clue.
But if he walked around, is,
Yeah,
somebody had to say something.
If he walked in New Orleans,
If he walked in Chicago, they said something.
It had to be something somebody says to them every day.
I know.
Yeah.
Somebody had to say, you look a little different.
You have to realize the migration from New Orleans to Chicago.
So-
they were probably saying we Spanish and Italian.
Exactly.
They got a bunch of light skins that moved to
I
Chicago.
know that. I had my relatives.
And in a video interview, when he was still a cardinal, and this is the only direct statement I think he's made on it, one of the questions an interviewer posed was, Your Eminence, what is your background? And he said, oh, all 4 of my grandparents were immigrants to the U.S. We know now that that's not true, but that's what they believe. So I think, yes, highlighting the Italian, the Spanish, maybe even French background, that's what they harped on. But definitely European, aka white.
Maybe they
I
have
think
no
that
idea.
the name has really like impressed a lot of people here because of Prevost. Oh yeah, and then they started appropriating and make it like a big deal.
Yeah,
Make it like.
Yeah, but you would be surprised. So the Pope has second cousins in Chicago, and you'll never. Well, if you're from South Louisiana, you wouldn't even believe this. Their last name is Rouzan, like Wanda Rouzan. But in Chicago, where there's no cultural context, you can walk around and be a Rouzan and totally identify as white because nobody knows that Rouzan tends to skew de couleur, and so people don't know.
Yeah.
He has cousins who are Fouriers.
Okay.
Anybody here know the Fourier family?
Yeah, I've heard of them.
He has cousins who are Bagnaris, or if you want to say Bonneries, who are in California.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you, I put my professional, they don't know. They simply don't know because there's no context. They would know, what that implicates, say, down here in Louisiana. And that's why they put that geographic distance between themselves and their homeland. And you're right. I've worked with many, many, many families who are passing and who are coming to a knowledge of who they are. And what they tell me almost to a person is, it's not that we didn't talk about what we now know is a heritage of color. We didn't talk about heritage at all.
Yeah.
And so many of them feel cheated because they feel as though when my classmates were able to do the little school activity, oh, I'm French, I'm Irish, I'm Chinese, I'm whatever, we basically were told nothing. Because, of course, they couldn't be told anything unless they were told intentional lies.
The most disconnected people in the world. That's probably why you go to South America and try to find people and really, and you don't even know yourself, but you're finding people who are created just like you. So politically, this man has to make a statement about this. Because whatever we consider where he came from, it was his church that brought all this on the world. They blessed it, they created it, and he ruled over it.
Absolutely.
And he has to acknowledge, not only is his heritage, what his heritage is, but what ugliness going about it. We consider our food wonderful, we consider everything wonderful. But what brought about these cultures, these whatever, was horrible.
Yes, it was.
And he has to acknowledge that the way he stands is the root.
Absolutely. Walter
And
White.
that's his area.
Walter White, who was a leader with the NAACP for decades, and who phenotypically was white. He was a man, a black man. And he utilized his color to actually go in the South and do all sort of undercover reporting. He said in 1928, he said every year there are upwards of 5,000 Negroes who conveniently forget their Negro blood. And when you talk about just here in South Louisiana, the family that for over 100 years owned the Baldwin Piano Company, one of the founding families of Johns Hopkins University, one of the founders of the Rose Parade in Pasadena, Mayor Moon Landrew and Mayor Mitch Landrew. All of these people have recent Afro-American ancestry. So you just think about all of the talents, all of the skills, all the leadership that exists, but it's credited, if you tally it all up, it's credited on the other side because these people passed for white. So it makes you wonder, how do we address all of this?
Right, and a lot of times, the people who run hardest. So that all of a sudden your brother gotta get rid of the Trump
Yes.
post.
Yes.
But you look like you got a perpetual tan.
I like that.
So you gotta be the worst.
I can
You gotta be the worst.
I can tell you this story. When I lived in California several years ago, I happened to go to this church, a Catholic church, and I met this lady, and we were talking. I was from New Orleans area, And she said, it was a white lady. She's like, her name was Patricia. She said, when I got family that live in New Orleans, she said, we just recently discovered we related to Mother Henrietta Lil. I said, well, yeah, I know all about Mother Henrietta Lil. She was telling me there's something from her brother Jean, I think it was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was telling me the whole story. I said, yeah. I said, are you want to claim Mother Henrietta Lil because she's famous, or I said, would you be claiming her if she weren't African, Asian, or what? She said, oh no, it's got nothing to do. I said, okay, now. I said, I'm gonna protect her first.
DNA testing, the rise of commercial DNA testing, and the last numbers that I saw, about 53 million people in this country, or through this country, through companies here based in the U.S. have done commercial DNA tests. That has led to a lot of discoveries, because young people who are in their teens, 20s, 30s, who grew up post-segregation, they're making all kinds of discoveries, and they're going home, grandmother, grandfather, what is this? What is this 10% sub-Saharan African that we have? And it's coming out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good thing. It's so, it was hidden for a long time, but it's definitely coming out.
I think the generations coming out now, Gen Z and Alpha, I think they're so open-minded, they want to discover the truth. I think this is, especially Alpha generation, I think that's going to be the healing generation. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's healing if they really pursue the question.
It's a caste system.
Let me tell you something. Where I live in the country, about 30 miles from here, you want to see integration, go to Walmart, you'll see white women pushing baskets with Haiti children.
Well, that's been happening for 4 years.
That's all
Charles Parish.
But that's all over the United States.
Yeah,
I'm not from
so
here.
okay,
But
that's what I'm
I've
saying.
seen that in the north where I come from.
So I mean, it's getting integrated.
But that's not healing. That's something that's what I'm just talking about where you come from.
Yeah.
That's always going to happen.
I think it's that questioning. If that questioning takes place from younger generations, grandmother, okay, fine. I see these and it's happened in my, branches of my own family. They'll confront their grandparents or great grandparents and say, well, we see these records that say colored or Negro or mulatto, but we're not that. Explain that to me, Grandma. Explain that to me, Grandpa. And why? Oh, well, darling, we did that because we had to survive, and we couldn't remain that and try to get ahead in life. Well, why couldn't you get ahead? And that's when that real history starts. Well, because we couldn't get this job, we couldn't go to this college, we couldn't go to this school, we couldn't do this, we couldn't do that, we couldn't live here, we wouldn't own this house if we were identified as other. Yeah. And so when those questions, I think that's when that sensitivity starts, to like, well, golly, if this was just 40, 50 years ago, and your whole life was circumscribed by something like race, then what about sexuality? What about gender? What about, economic status and all this other stuff? So hopefully that takes place. But, for as many people as you talk about up the river there, or even here in the city, where you see integrated families, there are a whole lot of enclaves in America where these families, I think, would die first rather than have an integrated family. And they tend to be the segments of society that have access to power, to money, to connections, politics, and everything else. And I think they'd rather hire a child, a daughter, or a brother.
Think about the Phelps case, where she spent all that money trying to declare herself as white.
And that was in the 80s.
That's my relative.
Your cousin.
Oh, yeah, that's my relative. So Susie.
She fought it tooth and nail, and she had a birth certificate that indicated, and she fought it tooth and nail. I am not.
Right. And so she came from the same lineage that I did. So that means that she's a daughter of the enslaved woman Marguerite. That people talk about, people written songs about her and everything in St. Landry Parish. Okay. And so that's my descent. So I'm direct descendant from Marguerite. And so as the research did, which ended up being a whole book of research, and that's why you have Born on the Kitchen Floor and Bois Mallet, which is the whole story of the Guillory. So we ended up getting all of our genealogical research done because of that case. Because of the case. So we have all of this information. But in the end, We come from the exact same line. So she came from the line that was descended from an enslaved woman that was free. That was free. And one of the first women of color to win a Supreme Court case in Louisiana as well.
Not to belabor the point, but if you all have a chance to read the book, it's a recent book by Bliss Broyard. Bliss's family is right here from New Orleans, and Bliss was reared as a white young lady in New York City. Her dad was actually the literary columnist for the New York Times for many years. And one of the things that she says in the book is that his mother, long distance, by way of phone call or whatever, when his mother passed, he had the funeral conducted and had her cremated, and the ashes, the remains, sat on the top shelf of their hallway closet for years. And this girl grew up thinking, oh, well, I guess I'm one of those kids who, maybe my grandmother died before I was born. I don't have a grandmother. I'm one of those kids who doesn't have a living grandmother. Until her father died, and then she said, my God, my grandmother was in the closet all the time. And she's like, she confronted her widowed mother, and like, Mom, why didn't y'all tell us? Why didn't you even tell us, even if we didn't know her, dear, your grandmother died today. You didn't really know her, but because the mother was living as a woman of color and the son was not. And so when you talk about something that immediate, that you don't even bury your own mama, and don't even inform your kids that they have a grandmother who's living and that their grandmother passed away, and you don't even follow through with the burial of your mom because you can't be associated. That tells you the depths that people will go through to conceal this information.
Are there people today that are still passing for white?
Sure.
Sure. Because of the status and privilege and everything, so no one can associate it with it.
One of the sad realities is I have peers who may be phenotypically on the lighter side of things and not necessarily a rigid, passing, but socially, their social contacts, their school contacts, their professional associations are all intentionally with people who are white identified. And of course, me always like in the stir the pot, how, hey, where you at, Joe? I see you. How you doing? And of course, they're like, oh my God, please don't know me. But it happens. It happens. So so we make some.
That's why the color of the skin, the paper bag, the blue vein, everything that just separate you from what is black and what was
I'm black.
Yeah.
We know.
The ugly which was colonized.
Yes.
The prevalence, I can find it, I can find my country in Mauritius, in Royal Island, in Martinique. There's a lot of prevalence everywhere.
Absolutely. Very common. Very common.
Actually, it means C7.
Yes. It's a civil fiction.
During the 1950s, racism.
I just recently watched the movie Imitation of Life, after
After
the Pope Leo thing.
Oh, you never seen it?
I had never seen. So my mom. Yeah, I never seen it.
So did you see the 1950s version?
I saw the 1950s version.
Okay.
With
Lana Turner.
Yeah,
The
so
older one was from 1930s.
So I rented it from the library and I watched it because, again, growing up, people talked about it, but I never watched it because I thought it was an older movie. But then, so I watched it, and then it reminded me of a time when somebody asked me. My dad went to my mom's family reunion, and he was like, "There's some people who walked in. They must have the wrong room in the hotel because they were white." And she was like, "No, those are my cousins. They're from D.C." So my mom's family's from Mississippi, and then some of them moved to Mississippi for better opportunities, and then some of them have began not really passing as white, but people mistakenly identified them as white because they have fair skin, blue eyes, blonde hair, etc. So that interested me into the dynamics of people who intentionally pass and the people who get mistaken as passing. Because if you guys see my cousins who are lighter than me, they will say they're black, and then it confuses people, but it's just part of, I guess, the history of Louisiana and the Creole culture.
And that realization has always been there. If you go back to the 1890s with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, the Comité des Citoyens, the Citizens Committee that funded and planned the Plessy case, one of the arguments they made was, if race is so, because that was, it was all set up.
Yeah.
They had a private detective, private policeman on board the car to ask Mr. Plessy, aren't you colored? Aren't you Plessy the shoemaker? You have to go to the colored car. Because Mr. Plessy was indeed so fair, nobody would have known. And so the point of it all was, if race is so indeterminate that you contracted with me, I gave you money, you gave me a ticket for the white car, then who's to say you're right and I'm wrong? What if I have a birth paper that says white? But I mean, I may know I'm of color, but if it's the indeterminacy of all of this that they said made it absurd. Made it absurd. Of course, they lost the case, but I think it was so forward thinking of most people.
It seems to me that once Louisiana became an American state, that a lot of the people of color lost a lot of privileges, and they had to prove that they were free or came from free people of color, because under the French and Spanish regime, under the Code Noir and manumission and coartation, which the Spanish will later add, it's like they were given, they were at the zenith of their prosperity. They owned 80% of the French quarter at one time. I think it was free women of color and a lot of land and everything, even though the Spanish were a contradiction at times too, because they had some of the most brutal slave tactics in Louisiana, where in the rural areas, where any time the blacks and the Indians combined together and formed these colonies, these maroon colonies, and they almost brought the Spanish government down because of it. They would steal their crops and kidnap their women and children and bring them back and breed with them, or sacrifices to them. It's really a contradiction. I tell people, if you're living in French Louisiana or Spanish Louisiana, slavery was there, but there was an opportunity for black people and the Indian people to get their freedom like nowhere else you would have had in the 13 colonies also.
Yeah, and that, you're right, and that harkens back to, that harkens all the way back to, slavery in the Roman Empire. And this understanding that slavery is not necessarily a fixed status, that they understood it as a legal construct.
Yeah. And
you can be manumitted from slavery, you can, be sold into slavery and all this kind of thing. And then race was understood differently than in the Anglo-American world, where it's either you bear the mark of, of the second tier, of the second class people, or you bear, or you are white, and there's sort of no in between. That definitely becomes more rampant once we become a part of the United States. But at the same time, you have to say that under the French and under Spanish, remember, everybody is a subject of His Most Christian Majesty, Le Roi, or His Most Catholic Majesty, the King of Spain. And so there is no voting. There is no election to office. All of those things don't take place. So when all of that becomes a part of our worldview, as U.S. citizens, black people have no role as citizens. They cannot vote. They cannot be elected to office. They cannot send their children to the public schools, even though they pay taxes. At different points in time, starting especially in the 1840s and 50s, they cannot congregate without white supervision, which means that they can't even form a church on their own. St. James A&B is a perfect example of that. So, it's this, I think, incremental progression towards just absolute restrictions. And like we showed earlier, that's why so many of them say, I'm going somewhere. I'm going to Mexico, I'm going to Haiti, I'm going to France. And you'd be surprised, the families, and I've met with many of them, the Roudenez family, the Roudenez Republican, the Roudenez family in France are clear about who they are. The Roudenezes in America, within 30 years after their patriarch's death, all of the American Roudenezes had gone over to the white side.
I just find it fascinating because it makes me think about when I was a child, and my dad's brother lived in New York. He fell out of a tree and died in the creek. And he had been written out of the family will because in Mississippi where my dad was from. The money they had acquired from the French, the German grandfather. But one of the things they did was that they was going to be black people with that, and he left. And my grandmother brought him out the will, and he lived in New York for years, and he fell out of a tree. He died in prison. My dad was going to New York for his brother, and I said, well, it was summertime. I said, I want a trip to New York. I was like 13 or something like that. I want to go to New York. Well, I can't take you. My brother was white. I was like, what? I said, you can't take me. What they gotta do with? What they gotta do with me? I still want to go to New York. Just because you married a black woman, you know, that don't mean that don't mean I wanted a trip. I wanted. He could still have been white, but he respected that enough.
Yeah.
That he was gonna go there and not bring me, because I was like, I'm not just that man's child. I'm on a trip to New York.
Yeah.
But I don't want to bring that, any kind of
Stigma to that.
stigma.
Yeah.
In New York.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm sorry I told that story for you. But yeah,
Bring it up tomorrow.
you will bring it up. Yeah, but I was like, wait a minute. I was like, it's summertime, and you taking a trip for this man who we never knew. But we gonna keep that.
There's a famous case in Philadelphia, so it doesn't even involve Louisiana, of the McKee family, MCKEE. And there's still a McKee trust that gives educational grants to children of color and underprivileged children and everything. And Colonel John McKee, who was a man of color, one of his grandsons, who had been living, I think, in New York City as white when the grandfather died, and he wanted to break the will so as to get some of the estate, he, in effect, crossed back over and said, oh, no, I don't know what y'all talking about. My grandfather was white, and I'm white, so I'm entitled to the money. And so he basically tried to negate all of his grandfather's history and say, oh, well, he was taken for colored. And he made a choice to associate in the colored community, but he was actually white like I am, and so therefore give me the money. So yeah, you have Louisiana examples like that as well, where families will sort of cross back across the color line because they want the money that their colored relations actually have. So it just, again, it shows you the absurdity of it all.
But those people, so some of his children would, after my dad went up there, and they would call, because they wanted to know. They lived on, they didn't know who they were. They lived on islands. They thought their dad was like this. Somebody who fell out of a tree, like literally just fell out of a planet, and they knew nobody else. And they would call and they were like, "Oh, we want to come in." And my father never encouraged them to come and find out anything. I said, "Why?" I said, "Do that, Papa." I said, "Tell him something." And he said, "Why?" And he would just basically say, "Why they need to go through that?"
Why open up a can of